Lord of the Ice Garden is a board game based on a Polish fantasy novel, which I haven't read. I tried to get a sense of the story from the information about the story that you have in the rulebook. From what I gleaned there, the story should be as follows. There's a group of scientists that travels on a distant planet, so you have a sci-fi element there, and the planet turns out to be a sort of fantasy planet with magic and creatures that usually we identify with fantasy. These scientists that come to study the planet become corrupted by the land, become corrupted by the magical energies of the land, and they become these sort of like evil overlords that now are fighting against each other to take control of the land. So from somebody who is supposed to study the place to somebody who is trying to take control of the place, to rule the place. Heart of Darkness kind of thing. So you have a fantasy story with a sci-fi element and with horror elements, and a specific type of horror, a Cthulhian horror. You see here certain Lovecraftian atmosphere in the darker tones of the game. There are many ways of adding darker tones to a game. The ones in here specifically have that sort of flavor. And if this description of the story is completely incorrect, please feel free to explain what the real story is about in the comments. I'll be happy to learn more about the book. One thing that is also important though is that at some point in the book it appears, but certainly in the game, there is another character from Earth, a guy called Vuko, that comes to capture or to stop the 4 scientists that went rogue. And this Vuko, who is the enemy of the lords, or the aspiring overlords of the land, is represented by a non-playing character in the game. There's a part of the turn in which you resolve the actions of Vuko. In this it reminded me of Age of Conan, in which you do have players that are controlling political and military expanding entities, and then there is a non-playing character that moves around the board and does stuff. And in this game the players are, similarly to Age of Conan or Cthulhu Wars, representing these sort of political military entities that are trying to expand their dominion. The game, I mentioned Chaos in the Old World, is very reminiscent of Chaos in the Old World, in the sense that you have the 4 characters that represent evil entity. They summon minions that work in different ways and generate non-symmetrical gameplay. Even though I have to say the non-symmetrical aspect of the design is much more prominent in Chaos in the Old World than it is here. Here, the 4 characters that the players can play are different from one another, especially when it comes to the objectives. When it comes to what they can do, there's differences, but there are more similarities that you find in Chaos in the Old World. Anyhow, let me show you how the game works. Here's a general view of the board of the game. It looks pretty nice, vaguely reminiscent of the board for Game of Thrones, the board game, and actually, to be honest, many other fantasy-themed war games. Here you have the main area of the board divided in regions. This is where the players will place their units and execute their actions. Here you have a track called the Dead Snow track. Certain actions that the players perform will move a marker on that track, and if the marker reaches the end of the track, then the game is over. You determine who the winner is. Here you have a reputation track on top of which you place a marker for each player that is playing the game. Probably this track should have been called the infamy track, because certain actions that you perform will push your marker down on this track, and it simply means that the lower your marker goes, the more of this, whatever it is, you accumulate, the less reputable you are. The less good reputation you have, the more reputation you have. So you want your marker to go up to have good reputation, but very often it will go down, because that means you're doing things that don't look very good. Before we move closer to the board and I start telling you about things more in detail, I want to give you a sense of the general flow of the game. Each turn, the players will receive a certain number of actions that they can perform, and there is an area there that you use to determine how many actions each player receives. Actions are represented by action cubes, then the players will alternate placing in these boxes here. Basically, like it happens in other games such as Dominant Species, there is a phase each turn in which players are placing action cubes to reserve actions. Once all of the cubes have been placed, then you simply go through the boxes top to bottom, resolving each action. So each player simply removes one of the cubes that they place there, and they get to resolve the corresponding action. Here you have a track that is used to determine the number of actions that each player receives each turn. You stack a marker for each player at the beginning of that track there, and the first turn these markers do not move. The position of a marker indicates the number of actions that the player has available, and the number of actions are indicated by these cubes here. So in turn 1, every player receives three actions, the action cubes to be placed on the action boxes. Then, starting from turn 1, players can start moving their markers. The markers move towards the right, and they can move by 1 or 2 positions, following some rules and restrictions. I'm not gonna give you the details now. But the important thing is that after you move all of the markers, the position of your marker will tell you how many action cubes you will have. However, as you can see, the positions on this track are represented by ships that also have numbers on them, and the number is simply used to resolve the turn order, to decide who starts taking actions first, and the player that has a marker, their marker on ship number 1 goes first. Usually that will be the leftmost, but that doesn't have to be, because if somebody is here on a ship number 1, actually they will go first if there's no one with a ship number 1 in this area. So that indicates the order in which player will move and the number of actions that they will take. So actions, as I said, are represented by action cubes that will need to be placed on action boxes. Let me show you what these action boxes are and the things that they can do for you. Here there is an action box that you can use to reserve, to produce resources. This is a particularly expensive action box because if you need to place an action cube there, you also need to place another smaller cube. Each player has a number of smaller cubes that represent influence, and these smaller cubes during the game will go on the board, on the various regions of the board, to indicate the presence of influence of the players in the region or regions in which those little cubes are. So if you're placing a cube, an influence cube there, you cannot put it there anymore because this small cube will need to stay there until the end of the game. You get the action cube back at the end of the turn, but not the influence cube that you placed there. But when it is time to resolve actions for each cube that you have there, you gain a resource. Resources are magic, represented by these tokens here. Then you have money or coins, and you have population. Another thing that you can do when you have a cube here is simply to trade 2 markers of any kind that you may have in your stock with a marker of another kind. Here you have the action box to place influence on the board. That allows you to place influence. You place your action cube or cubes there, starting from box number 1, only until this track is filled. Then when it is come to resolve actions, actually the order in which the actions is resolved is reversed from the order in which you place the cubes down, because you start from the rightmost and you go in descending order. So if this is the case, then red player will go twice here, will get to place influence on the board twice before green player does so. For each action that you resolve from this box, you can place population, actually you can place influence on the board at a cost. For each such action, you can spend 2 population tokens to place 2 influence markers on the board, or you can simply spend a single population token to place a single influence point on the board. So this is the action that you perform to place influence markers. But maybe the influence markers, you don't want them to stay there forever, so you preserve that action there. This action, to actually resolve it, will cost money. You can spend 2 coins to move 2 action markers from the area in which they are to adjacent areas. Or you can spend a single coin to do the same, to move a single marker to another area. This is for regular movement. There's another movement which is a little more exciting, but also incredibly expensive. The rules call this action the Voracious Mountain, and the illustration is pretty impressive. Look at it. The way I conceptualize it is there's this tricky mountain. You enter, it allows you to travel really fast, in really far away locations, but it eats some of your people. It is a pretty expensive action. You need to spend 2 population markers, but then that allows you to move any number of your tokens from one region to any one other region. It's a fast way of moving, but expensive. This action allows you to make amendments. As I said, there are actions that will reduce your reputation. If you spend an action there, then you push your reputation marker up by 2 spaces on the reputation track. You can also use it to use that action to get rid of Vuko markers. Vuko is this annoying non-playing character that will come and do bad stuff against you. One of the things that Vuko does is it leaves a marker in your play area when he visits you, and that marker will count against you at the end of the game, unless you're using that action to remove a Vuko marker. Now we get to by far the most interesting action in the game. It is called, in a pretty unexciting way in the rulebook, making. What? It simply means to create, to manipulate and customize your minions. As I showed you, you place influence markers on the board, and these are represented by an exciting small cubes, but you also have much more interesting minions, which are represented by miniatures. Each player has 3 level 1 minions, so smaller and weaker minions. Then you have 2 level 2 minions, bigger and scarier. And then you have a big monster here, which is your level 3 minion. For this player, this would be the minions. I call them minions. They're called special units in the game. These are much more powerful units. And each player has a card to keep track of the abilities of the minions. Now, when you reserve the making action, you can pretty much interact with your card to do stuff with your minions. Here in this card, you will place magic tokens. When you receive magic tokens in the game, they initially go here in the 0 box of this board here. Each player has a different board. And when you are taking this action, there are 3 actions that you actually can perform. You can perform any and all of them. One action allows you to move your magic markers from the 0 box to other boxes here. Each box corresponds to a type of minion, level 1, level 2, or level 3. Suppose I spend an action and I move that marker there and that marker there. Taking this action also increases the amount of bad reputation that you have, and it moves the marker on the Dead Snow track. It's important to move your markers here because the magic markers need to be by a certain location for you to be able to summon a creature.
if you have a marker there, then you can take the action of summoning, you simply spend that marker and you place a corresponding creature on the board in an area where you have influence. And you can do that with multiple creatures at the same level for a single action, but that increases your level of infamy considerably. Another thing that you can do, as you can see, there are symbols here. They represent the actions that your minions can perform, but you also see that there are empty areas here, simply because there are hexagonal tokens that you can buy, and that will add more actions to your minion. So you can add actions that allow your minion to move, to attack, to do all sorts of stuff. But that, again, will cost reputation, will move, then that's no marker. And also it costs other resources that you have to spend to purchase upgrades. So this is what you can do with this action. Move the markers to make your units available, possibly spend extra resources to customize your units, and then summon the units on the board. After that is done, after players have taken that action, here you have a box that is not really an action that players have to reserve. It is pretty much a reminder of what happens after this phase here, which is the special units on the board, special units like the ones I showed you, the ones represented by miniatures and not by cubes. These special units, nice one, eh? These special units get to perform actions based on the actions that they have available on the board. This action here means that they can attack and inflict a hit on an opponent. This action means that they can move, and then each player has specific symbols to represent unique actions that his minions can perform. But this is when you get to attack in influence points of the opponent or miniatures of the opponent, when you manage to deal damage. And there are other special actions that these characters can do. These two actions are specific of two players. The majority of what will happen here during this phase is moving minions that have a movement value and using minions to attack. But these are mercenaries. They are not fighting for you out of their loyalty or good heart. You need to spend 2 coins to activate them for movement. For attack, I mean. Then you have the Vuko action, so the guy represented by this miniature here will come after the player that has the worst reputation in the game. So the player that is the lowest on the reputation track will get a visit from him. You will place the miniature in the area of that player that has the most influence. And also these special units, not only do they perform special actions for you, they also have influence. So you total the influence that's represented by influence cubes and possibly miniatures, and you determine the area of the least reputable player that Vuko will visit. When he goes in that area, he sort of like temporarily captures a token that you cannot use to towards domination, to determine domination at the end of the turn. Also, if there is a special unit of the player that is being targeted there, Vuko will kill that unit. And on top of that, as I said earlier, Vuko will drop a Vuko marker as a friendly token of friendship, not really enmity, to the player that was just visited. At the end of each turn, you determine domination. You simply determine for each area in play which player controls the area, and for each area in the game, the player that controls the area is the player with the most domination. That may be affected, for example, by the presence of Vuko. These symbols represent neutral population. It simply means that when there is a neutral independent population in the area, single cube is not enough to establish domination. It's not enough to get resources from that area. You need at least 2. But there are also ways of eliminating the independent nations. So you determine domination, and then you look at these markers here, the marker for the area that you just resolved. These markers are placed randomly on the board at the beginning of each game to give resources to different regions in different games. And then the player that has dominance, that has the highest total influence in there, will get to choose one of the available resources first. In this case, the player that has the highest influence in this area can choose to get 2 coins or 2 population tokens. The player which is second in influence in there will get to choose whichever resource is left. In this case, if there is a third player that has a presence, they will not get anything, but there are the tokens that will give something to the first 3 players that have presence there. But again, they'll get to choose in order of influence or presence there. In some turns, and some turns only, you also get to score points for the regions that you control. And in that case, again, you look at the most influence, second influence, third influence, and that tells the number of points that each player scores. Players will record the number of victory points that they score on this track. You score victory points for scoring regions in some turns, and you also get victory points for slaughtering enemy units. And one of the 3 ways in which the game may end is if one of the players scores 50 points, reaches the bottom of the track, then that player wins the game. The other way, as I think I mentioned earlier, is if the game ends because that snow track is completed, then the player with the best reputation or the least infamy, so the player that is highest on this track, is the winner of the game. Then each player also has a special condition. Player playing is asymmetrical because each player has a way of ending the game which is different from what the other players can do. For example, this player is harvesting magic from the land. This other player, a little boring, is just trying to build towers, so this player has a set of towers. Another player is trying to spread nightmares, and if it spreads enough nightmare markers, it locks an area. It makes it so terrible that it's completely uninhabitable, that markers have to move out. So different ways of ending the game. Usually the idea is that your minions will do things for you that will allow you to get closer to your specific unique victory condition, but for the minion to be able to perform the special action, the minion needs to be the dominant minion, or a minion of the dominant party in a region when you're checking for dominance towards the end of each turn.
Now, something important, the game that you saw in this video that I played and I'm reviewing is the first edition of the game. Right now the game is on Kickstarter, a second edition is in the works, but from what I see on Kickstarter it appears that the second edition is going to be pretty much a reprint of the first one with a different rulebook, with an updated rulebook. That is definitely a desirable change because the original rulebook, while not terrible, while not, I would say, plagued by glaring mistakes, does have some gray areas and does have some omissions. Frequently situations arose during gameplay that were not covered by rules in the rulebook. So we went online, looked for a new version of the rulebook, we found the second version, and that version did address all the questions that we had. So definitely the publisher has realized that something was to be desired in the first edition. That is to say that you can purchase the Kickstarter edition, which is coming out now, so you have the printed new edition. If in the future you're watching this review and you're considering purchasing a copy of the game, I believe that the first edition will be pretty much the same as long as you can find the second edition rulebook. And if the publisher makes it available online, as it is very possible, I believe that the first edition will be pretty much or almost as good as the second one. So this is for the rulebook. Do not waste your time with the first edition of the rulebook. Go to the second one immediately. But as for gameplay, this is a game that it would be too harsh to call half-baked, but I did have the sense that it was three-quarter baked, not entirely baked, almost baked. Something was unpolished, something was missing in gameplay. In the fact that the options that you had as a character weren't all that interesting, were pretty repetitive. There wasn't a large range of actions. There are games in which you reserve your actions in a phase of the turn and then you resolve those actions that you reserved, and there are challenges in the way in which you reserve your actions, the order in which you reserve the actions, because somebody else may completely use all the actions that you will like, and so on and so forth. Dominant Species does that perfectly. That's a game that I love very much. It uses that mechanically wonderfully. Here it feels a little more limited. In any case, more or less we were always able to do what we wanted to do. There wasn't a tough fight for reserving actions. So that part seemed a little less interesting and exciting. There aren't many actions. The mountain that devours your minions is a very expensive action to use. You won't use it very often. One of the actions is pretty much a non-action, which is you're improving your stats, but it simply means that when that action is resolved, you're rolling your thumbs. You unroll them just to remove your cube, and then you're back doing that. Of course, there may be other actions that you do, but that action holds no interest whatsoever per se. So what is left here is that you are simply buying your resources, adding cubes, and moving cubes, and resolving actions on that your minions perform, resolving combat and things like that. And then Vuko does his thing. Which is could be done better. I think that could be have handled better. Vuko's actions could be incredibly interesting, as the actions of Conan are in Age of Conan. The idea that you have a non-playing character that does unpredictable things, that interacts in fun ways with the players is excellent. Is not fully implemented here because Vuko is pretty monomaniacal in what he does. Goes around and kills people, does bad stuff to you. So first, as a character, he's not all that interesting. But also there are ways of distracting him, by following the rules, so the guidelines of where he's going to move next. You can manipulate things on the board so that you send him where you want him to be, or where he's not affecting your interest. So he's a non-playing character, but he can be gullible at times. You can direct him where you want him to in certain ways. Unfortunately, that emphasizes a bit of the abstract nature of the game. Yes, you have beautiful components. Oh my gosh, this game looks so pretty, from the board to the miniatures especially, the players. It looks very pretty. But as gameplay was progressing, I find myself counting cubes and counting other players' cubes and figuring out ways of having 7 cubes instead of 6, or eliminating a cube and moving a single cube, much more than I was enjoying the theme or enjoying the beauty of the components, or experiencing the game in any the theme in any way that was, I wouldn't say immersive, but I would simply say engaging. The theme to me was still pretty abstract. Now, this may be because I did not read the original rulebook, so there are things here that seem mechanically uninteresting or mechanically irrelevant or not all that exciting. But if you read if you read the original book, you may be like, oh my gosh, that's amazing, look how Vuko does exactly like it does in the rulebook. What an elegant way they found to represent the theme of the book. But I haven't read the book. This being said, however, there are also games that I played without knowing the original source, and I enjoyed them. They felt tight. Game of Thrones is a prime example of this, because I played that game before I was familiar with the novels, and I still thought that was a heck of a great game. Here I did not have that sense. I do think that If you read the book, probably you're going to enjoy it very much. Probably you're going to find a lot of things that are reminiscent. But without knowing the book, it just feels that there are things in there that are not all that interesting. I do have the sense, oh, this probably makes sense, especially because the book must have something like this. They don't feel necessary and fully ingrained in the design as things are. So, let me clarify, this is not a game that we hated, but as we were playing it, we constantly kept talking about things that seemed just slightly off, could have been handled slightly better, could have been made slightly more interesting. It is a game that reminded me mechanically of many other games. I just found many things here that that I found in other games before. The non-symmetrical gameplay from Chaos in the Old World, reserving actions and then resolving them, like you have in Dominant Species or in Shogun. The non-playing character from Age of Conan, things like that. The problem, however, is that every time that I spotted one of these similarities, I realized that I liked the way in which implemented in the other games better. It is not the fact that these mechanics can be seen in other games too that bothers me, because that you can see everywhere. That there's no secret that creativity is not about coming up with something completely new. It is about mixing old ingredients in an innovative way. Here, it didn't have the sense that the overall mix was all that innovative. And when I realized what the ingredients were, or I found things in other games that kind of looked the same, almost regularly thought, yes, but I would rather be playing this mechanic in that other game because it just seemed better. So this is my assessment of Lord of the Ice Garden. It is a game that looks very beautiful, that feels similar to other fantasy games that combine warfare aspects with resource management elements, but overall these elements do not come together in a way that I find particularly fulfilling. I just feel that when I will want in the future to play a game of this sort, the Chaos in the Old World is still a much better option, and other games overall do similar things that are similar to the things that you see here, it's just that other games do them better.